The most dramatic changes in landscape for the arts in Boston are just down the road for theater groups. That especially concerns the Huntington Theatre Company. There's a new effort to help the organization continue on Huntington Avenue. Our guest is part of the campaign. We'd like to welcome the Executive Director of StageSource, Julie Hennrikus. Thank you very much for being with us, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, refresh the memories of people who heard about, well, you know, Huntington, they had this breakup with BU, maybe a polite breakup, but, you know, BU owns the property. It's going to be sold probably. So what does that mean?
Well, what that means or could mean for the Huntington, and the reason that the StageSource, Mass Creative Arts Boston, and the Fenway Alliance have come together to create a way of people understanding what's at stake and why we need to keep the Huntington on Huntington Avenue. Because what could happen is if a developer bought the lot, they could tear down the Huntington Theater, which would leave the Huntington, one of the largest nonprofit theaters in New England, homeless.
Well, it certainly is a great location for real estate, not necessarily arts related, but you know, a developer could also be a savior for this theater too.
Absolutely. So if they can work in partnership, keep the theater there, you know, build around it, there's a lot of different ways, and there are people far smarter than I am who can think about that. But you know, Huntington Avenue is called the Avenue of the Arts. So how we can have an Avenue of the Arts and not have a theater on that avenue is beyond me. So, you know, for that sake alone. But the Huntington's been there for 33 years. They employ, all told, over 400 people a year. You know, they serve over 33,000 students through their educational programs. You know, when I go to a meeting at the Huntington Theater, which I do on occasion, at 5 o'clock, the conference rooms in their office space become rehearsal spaces for fringe companies. They mentor companies, and they impact the entire theatrical ecology in ways that I don't think everyone understands. So to put this huge part of of the theatrical impact at risk is really troubling, and so we want to keep the Huntington on Huntington, which is why we're raising this campaign.
Talk about how serious the market forces are here, because if you cannot have at least one leading venue on Huntington Avenue there, what does that mean?
Well, it's, you know, it's tricky, and especially it's tricky in a city that is changing and real estate's becoming so expensive. And I like to point out that about a year ago, a little over a year ago, the Factory Theater closed, which was on Tremont Street, and it was a 50-seat theater, and it was for fringe companies, and you know, within the community it had a huge impact. But that was the first sort of, they decided to make a gym out of what had been a theater for 20 years or so. And since that time, the companies that were using the Factory Theater, many of them haven't produced again because that was the viable option. So the Huntington is a huge, important organization in the theater community, and yet they're at risk of losing their space. We need to understand that these you know, arts institutions need support. They need to be there. If they're gone, we miss them. And the impact is more than just a building. It's an entire community, and it's the ecology that's at stake. And
of course, they're also a resource. They do partnerships with organizations.
Huge.
I mean, Codman Academy, I think.
Huge. Codman Academy, all kinds of educational resources. They also have student matinees, so students come in. There are a lot of people whose first theatrical experience is going to the Huntington Theatre Company. You know, as I said, many of their employees also work in the fringe community, you know, so that they offer a paycheck, but they also let people work in the field. They're a tremendous resource. It's a lot of people. It's a large organization. It's not the largest arts organization by far in Boston, but it is within the theater community. It is absolutely the largest nonprofit.
I usually think of the Huntington Theater as being filled and busy most nights of a given week, but the bigger picture in Boston is we have a lot of seats in venues that aren't being filled often enough, and at the same time we're worried about contractions. So how do you work that out?
Well, it's 2016 is a different time than there was in the past. And commercial theater and the way it's booked and who books it and what shows come in is an entire different metric than nonprofit. So you're absolutely right. The Huntington Theater on Huntington Avenue is always busy, and they've got a small theater is affiliated with BU. But if it were just the Huntington programming, it would also be very, very busy. The larger theaters need to book through commercial or different kinds of productions, and there's an economy of scale, and they're sort of wrestling with what that business model is. But it's not, I think it's time for some new thinking and some new envisioning on what it is to produce theater and what can, we have this traditional for the last 30 years. We haven't been as much a tryout town, but we've got this huge nonprofit world that is growing up. So now, 30 years in, how can we think about that differently and think about how to use some of these grand old theaters differently as well? But, Boston is also a lot of neighborhoods, and the Huntington is on the edge of a few neighborhoods and serves those neighborhoods as well. So we want to keep them there for that as well.
Talk about the Boston Foundation report that just came up, because we have all this, I guess, growth in potential audience. The demographics are changing and they're more diverse, but Boston Foundation says the funding, it hasn't changed that much.
No, not only has it not changed, it's diminished. 25 years ago, the Mass Cultural Council was funded at $25 or $26 million, and now we fight to haven't been able to get up to 15. So imagine if we'd stayed at that level for 25 years with growth that, in the economy, the impact that would have. So when you're talking about nonprofit arts organizations, there should be 4 ways of funding them. There should be individuals, there should be strong government support, there should be corporations, and there should be foundations. And in Boston, individuals fund a lot, and they're incredibly generous. But does it trickle down to the fringe and the independent artist? It doesn't really. The impact, and StageSource, though we're 30 years old, we're an art service organization. We're also one of those small arts organizations that is not funded to the degree that sister organizations in other cities are. So this is actually a moment for us to really figure out what's important. There's a huge vibrancy in the arts community, but it has been built on the backs of these small, these fringe, and these independent artists. And they self-fund, or they go out of business for after a while because they can't keep doing it to the degree they want to. There is, for the middle-sized theater companies, there's a risk aversion. The report talks about that.
And not much innovation.
Not much innovation on that level because they're running at 60% earned income, so they have to sell tickets so that, if it was reversed and they had more funding, they could be less risk adverse. There is a lot of innovation actually on the fringe community. I'm going to see a show Saturday night at Fresh Inc., which is up at Boston Playwrights Theater, and they do nothing but new work. There's a lot, Imaginary Beasts at the BCA, they also create new work all the time. But they don't get counted in many of these reports because they're not part of a funding stream that gets them into the mix. So we're missing a huge part of the conversation, but that doesn't mean the funding is less dire. It actually makes a case for the fact that we need to really address this.
Finally, we should mention people want to keep track of what's going on with Huntington and the Fenway and all this bigger picture here. What's the best way to do that?
Well, on Twitter, there's a hashtag Huntington on Huntington, and StageSource.org also can keep you up to date on what's going on with those issues and also what we're doing.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Julie Hennrikus from StageSource. Up ahead, a report from South Boston with Maureen Dayhill, but first, this message.